Kansas City, summer 2004. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air when the sound came that no one expected. A thud from the cockpit, sharper than turbulence, cut through the low hum of engines. At first passengers thought it was nothing, just the groan of machinery, but then a flight attendant's voice cracked through the intercom, breathless, strained, "Captain down. We need medical help up front." Silence followed, the kind that settles only when every soul on board senses danger. People glanced at each other with wide eyes, hands gripping armrests, whispers spreading like a brush fire. The captain had collapsed. The weight of that truth settled over 142 lives, and the air grew heavier than before. The second in command was young but paralyzed by the suddenness of it all, staring at lifeless hands on the controls. The plane shuddered as if echoing the uncertainty inside the cockpit. A thin line of sweat formed on his forehead, and though his mouth opened, no words came. A woman fainted in row 17, a baby cried from the back, and the flight attendants scrambled, shouting for any doctor. None stood up. That was when two teenage boys, seated near the middle, exchanged a glance. Their faces were pale but their eyes burned with something most passengers could not understand. 17 and 18, flight school trainees who had spent hours in simulators, never expecting their chance to prove themselves, would come 30,000 feet above the ground with no teacher beside them. They did not stand immediately. They hesitated, knowing how ridiculous it would sound. Kids, barely old enough to drive, claiming they could fly a commercial jet. But hesitation could kill, and as the plane tilted slightly off course, trays rattling, one of them unclipped his belt and whispered, "We can't wait. We have to move now." His friend nodded, jaw tight, and together they pushed past knees and startled passengers, toward the curtain that separated ordinary travelers from the cockpit where chaos was unfolding. The attendants blocked them at first, eyes wide, hands raised, not out of malice but out of sheer disbelief. The older boy, with freckles across his nose, said nothing at first. He just pointed to the drifting altitude reading flashing red on the display over the service panel. Then he said it, quiet but firm, "We know how to fly." The words barely reached above the engine roar, yet carried a weight no one could ignore. Doubt filled the faces around them. A man in a suit shook his head, muttering about insanity. But the attendants looked back at the cockpit, at the limp body of the captain on the floor, at the trembling co-pilot unable to steady the plane. Seconds mattered. With a reluctant nod, they pulled the curtain aside. The sight hit the teenagers harder than they expected. The captain, a veteran with gray hair and deep lines of authority etched on his face, lay unconscious, his chest barely rising. The co-pilot clutched the yoke like a drowning man clings to driftwood, his voice shaking as he muttered into the radio, "Mayday, mayday," but receiving only confusion from air traffic control. The boys stepped forward. Their voices trembled as they offered help, but their hands did not. They slid into the empty seat, one taking the captain's chair, the other crouching beside the console, scanning dials, remembering every simulator lesson, every instructor's warning. For a moment time froze. Behind them passengers waited with bated breath, every heart beating to the rhythm of the engines. The younger of the two whispered to his friend, "Remember checklists. We do this one step at a time." He wasn't sure if he said it for reassurance or survival, but it steadied them both. They touched the controls, tentative but determined, adjusting trim, pulling the nose back on course. The co-pilot's eyes widened, torn between disbelief and desperate hope. He stammered about procedure, about regulations, but deep inside he knew they were no longer in the realm of rules. They were in the realm of survival. Outside, the sky stretched endless and indifferent, white clouds drifting as if mocking the turmoil inside the cabin. A child asked his mother in the back why the plane was turning, but no one answered. The boys' knuckles whitened on the controls, sweat dripping into their collars, but the aircraft steadied, the erratic lurch smoothed into a fragile balance. The first crisis had passed, yet no one dared to breathe relief. Because in that moment, while passengers wiped tears and whispered prayers, none of them realized this was only the beginning. The engines hummed, the sky looked deceptively calm, but danger still waited. And the two who had dared to rise from their seats had no idea just how much more would be asked of them before the wheels ever touched the ground again. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, pressing into every ear as if the machine itself knew the stakes had shifted. The teenagers were seated where no one expected them to be, their bodies stiff with tension yet strangely anchored by the controls under their hands. The co-pilot, still shaken, tried to regain composure, but his voice broke each time he attempted to issue instructions. He was trained, yes, but training did not erase fear when the captain lay unconscious at his feet. One of the boys leaned closer to the console, eyes darting between blinking lights, dials, and levers, his memory rifling through hours spent in simulators back in the small hangar of their local flight school. He remembered his instructor's calm tone, the repetition of checklists, the mantra that flying was 90% discipline and 10% daring. That mantra was the only thread keeping his hands steady. The cabin behind them was restless. Murmurs turned into sobs, and sobs into quiet prayers whispered against windows that reflected nothing but endless sky. People were not built to feel powerless, yet here they sat, strapped into narrow seats, lives hanging on the trembling grip of two teenagers. Still, not one passenger knew who these boys really were. To them, they were just kids who had stood up when no one else did. No one saw the years of quiet obsession with flight, the weekends spent cleaning hangar floors in exchange for lessons, the hours flipping through dog-eared manuals long after midnight while their peers were out at football games. They had studied the way others dreamed, and now those dreams had turned into duty. The plane jolted suddenly and food trays crashed to the floor. A collective gasp spread through the cabin. The boys wrestled with the yoke, their bodies leaning forward in instinctive unison, as though one mind guided two sets of hands. Sweat dripped down the younger boy's temple, but his jaw was set, determined not to show the fear clawing inside him. The co-pilot, watching them, finally steadied enough to call air traffic control again. His voice was firmer now, announcing that the situation was under partial control, though he avoided explaining who exactly had taken that control. Pride and fear mixed in him. Admitting reliance on teenagers felt unthinkable, yet ignoring their grip on the plane was impossible. In the back, a flight attendant quietly rallied the passengers, passing bottled water, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Still, she understood the importance of appearances. People believed they were safe, they might act safe. Panic was the true killer, and it was her job to keep it at bay. She glanced once more toward the cockpit, where the boys' silhouettes bent over the instruments, and she felt a flicker of something rare, faith in the unexpected. Minutes stretched longer than they should. The aircraft's nose steadied, altitude evened, and for a brief spell it seemed as though stability had returned. A fragile calm spread among the passengers. Some even unclenched their fists, whispering relief. But the calm was deceptive. A glance at the fuel gauge brought a fresh wave of dread. The numbers fell faster than they should. Too much time had been lost during the initial chaos, and the nearest runway was farther than comfort allowed. The boys exchanged another wordless look, the kind that spoke of shared fear and shared resolve. Neither needed to say what both knew. This flight was balanced on a knife's edge. They worked through the motions, recalling each checklist as best they could. Flaps, altitude, course corrections, all executed with precision that belied their age. Each small success was a lifeline thrown into the storm. Yet storms have a way of returning. Dark clouds thickened on the horizon, their edges bruised purple and gray, signaling turbulence ahead. The co-pilot muttered about rerouting, but options were shrinking by the second. The teenagers listened, processing every word, their minds already scanning alternatives. It was not just a matter of flying straight anymore, it was a matter of choosing the lesser of many dangers. In row 12, an elderly man clutched a rosary, his lips moving silently, while beside him a young mother clung to her toddler as though sheer will could anchor them to life. People across the cabin found their own rituals, hands gripping seatbacks, eyes squeezed shut, letters scribbled on napkins that might never reach their intended. Every passenger lived in a private bubble of dread, yet all their fates were tied to the two boys in the cockpit who had no such luxury of retreating inward. Their thoughts had to remain sharp, outward, focused entirely on the instruments and the invisible path through the sky. The storm came faster than expected. The first drops streaked across the windows, followed by a violent shudder that rattled overhead compartments. Oxygen masks trembled in their casings, ready to drop at the slightest command. The younger boy's knuckles whitened as he corrected the tilt, forcing the aircraft back into balance, while the older one adjusted settings with frantic precision. For a heartbeat, it seemed they might lose control altogether, but the plane steadied again, a testament to instincts sharpened by countless hours in a simulator that had never once threatened real lives. As the storm swallowed them, lightning flickered against the wings, casting sharp shadows inside the cabin. Passengers gasped at each flash, flinching as though light itself could tear them apart. The co-pilot finally found his voice, shouting instructions to the teenagers, guiding them through maneuvers, his tone more confident now, as though their courage had ignited his own. They were no longer just boys. In this crucible of fear, they were pilots in every sense of the word. Still, beneath the steady hands and forced calm, doubt lingered. What if their training wasn't enough? What if the storm grew worse? What if fuel ran out before they saw land? These questions hung heavy, unanswered, circling in the silence between words. Yet there was no time to dwell. The plane surged forward into the storm's belly, and the passengers braced, unaware that the most difficult decisions had yet to be made. The first test had shown the boys could hold the aircraft steady. But storms, fuel, and fate were converging into something larger, something that would demand more than skill. It would demand a miracle. And though no one knew it yet, that miracle was still hours away. The storm wrapped around the aircraft like a living thing, pressing its weight against metal and glass, making every rivet groan as if protesting. The boys gripped the controls, shoulders stiff, their breaths coming fast but measured, trained to stay steady even when the world seemed determined to shake them apart. Outside, streaks of lightning carved across the sky, blinding flashes that painted the cabin in unnatural light. Every flash reminded them that time was not their ally. The fuel gauge continued its merciless decline, each number slipping lower, each tick of the needle a reminder that the distance to safety was shrinking too slowly. Passengers whispered and clutched each other as turbulence threw them against belts and armrests. Drinks spilled, luggage shifted overhead, and somewhere in the back a child cried until his voice grew hoarse. Still the boys did not look back. They could not. Every ounce of focus had to stay fixed on the instruments, the radio chatter, the unseen ground beneath them. The co-pilot barked coordinates from his seat, voice firmer now but tinged with desperation. He had accepted what pride had resisted earlier, that his survival and the survival of everyone aboard rested not in his hands, but in theirs. For a moment the storm thinned, offering a glimpse of clarity. Through a break in the clouds, the boys caught sight of the horizon. That sliver of light felt like hope. But hope can deceive. The radio crackled with a message that cut through the momentary calm. The nearest airport was closed due to the storm, runways slick and winds too dangerous for landing. Options narrowed to nothing. The co-pilot pressed his palms into his temples, muttering that they might have to circle until conditions improved. The older boy shook his head, sweat dripping into his collar. Circling was impossible, the fuel would not allow it. Every extra minute in the air was a gamble they could not win. The storm closed again around them, darker now, as if mocking the fragile courage they carried. The younger boy's mind raced back to lessons in the simulator, scenarios that had seemed exaggerated at the time. Emergencies with impossible odds, instructors pushing them to think beyond fear. He remembered the phrase repeated like a drumbeat, "Planes are not just flown, they are fought for." And so he fought, nudging the yoke with precision, adjusting their course toward a patch of radar that showed a less violent path. It was not an airport, not a beacon of safety, but it was something. In the cabin, tension thickened. Passengers wrote farewell notes on napkins, folded them into trembling hands, tucked them into pockets as if paper could outlast fire. A woman whispered the Lord's Prayer under her breath, each word carried like fragile glass. An older man, his face lined with years of work and loss, sat silently, his eyes fixed not on the storm outside but on the two shadows moving in the cockpit, the boys who carried his fate. In that silence, he found a strange calm, as if trusting them was the only choice left. The plane jolted again, a violent drop that made stomachs rise into throats. Oxygen masks trembled but did not fall. The younger boy's fingers flew across switches, correcting pitch, his body swaying with the aircraft as if instinctively balancing its weight. The older one scanned gauges, calling out readings that barely rose above the engine roar. The storm was not letting them go. Every second demanded more strength than the last. And then came the false relief. A gap opened in the clouds, wide enough to show the land below. Fields and roads stretched like a map, and there, faint but visible, a strip of concrete, an old regional airfield long abandoned but still marked. To the passengers, the sight of ground felt like salvation. A murmur of hope swept through the cabin, people leaning toward windows, pointing with trembling fingers. They believed the ordeal was ending. But the co-pilot's face told another story. The runway was too short for an aircraft of this size, the surface likely cracked and unstable. Landing there could tear the plane apart. Yet the fuel gauge offered no mercy. The boys' eyes locked. No words were spoken, but the question hung heavy. Risk a landing on unsafe ground or push onward with dwindling fuel? The co-pilot hesitated, torn between procedures and reality. Procedures said wait. Reality said they had no time. The older boy finally broke the silence with a whisper sharp as steel, "If we don't try, we'll never make it." It was not bravado, it was acceptance of the impossible. The aircraft banked, descending toward the strip. Passengers cheered at the motion, believing it meant safety. Relief washed across faces, hands unclasped from armrests, tears of gratitude spilled. They did not yet know the truth, that this was not salvation but another gamble with death. The boys worked in unison, flaps adjusted, throttle eased, descent calculated with more instinct than experience. The storm pressed them downward, crosswinds tugging at the fuselage, the plane fighting every correction. At the last moment the younger boy saw it. Debris scattered across the cracked runway, weeds breaking through concrete, hazards that could shred tires and split wings. He pulled hard, lifting the nose, abandoning the descent. Gasps filled the cabin as the plane climbed sharply, drinks flying, bodies pressed into seats. Hope turned into horror once more. Passengers cried out, unable to understand why the ground was denied to them after being so close. The aircraft leveled again, higher now, slicing back into clouds. The boys said nothing, their jaws tight, their eyes fixed ahead. The false salvation had vanished. Fuel reserves had slipped even lower. They had gambled and lost precious time, and now the path forward was even narrower. In the silence that followed, broken only by the steady drone of engines, every heart on board understood the gravity. They were flying with ghosts now, ghosts of options that had vanished, of landings that never came. And though none could see it yet, the storm had one more trial waiting, a moment that would push the teenagers beyond every limit they thought they had. What happened next would not just test their skill. It would test whether fate itself had chosen them to carry 142 lives safely home. The engines strained as the aircraft clawed its way back into the storm, the aborted landing leaving passengers shaken and confused. Relief had evaporated in an instant, replaced with the raw terror of being pulled once more into the clouds with nothing beneath them but uncertainty. The older boy's chest ached from holding his breath too long, his knuckles still stiff from yanking the yoke. His younger companion focused on the horizon indicator, jaw clenched, forcing his mind to shut out the cries from the cabin behind them. The fuel gauge needle trembled on the edge of the red, and that trembling was more frightening than the storm itself. Time was no longer measured in minutes. It was measured in drops of fuel, each second dripping away their chances of survival. The co-pilot, pale and trembling, finally seemed to grasp the truth he had tried to deny. They had no margin left for error. He leaned forward, his voice lower now, steadier, giving them every scrap of information he could. Airports within reach, wind patterns, emergency procedures usually reserved for simulations. His fear was still there, but it had hardened into something else, a reluctant belief in the two who sat where children should never sit. For the first time he addressed them not as intruders but as fellow pilots. That acknowledgement was small, but it gave the boys a surge of strength, enough to keep their hands steady despite the shaking metal around them. The storm worsened as dusk approached, swallowing what little light remained. The sky outside turned a bruised purple, lightning illuminating the wings in violent flashes. Inside the cabin, oxygen masks finally dropped, swinging like pendulums in the dim air, a cruel reminder of fragility. Passengers pulled them over their faces with trembling hands, breaths coming in shallow bursts, their eyes locked on the cockpit door as if salvation could only emerge from there. In row 9, a young mother pressed her forehead to her toddler's mask, whispering lullabies muffled by plastic, trying to protect innocence from the terror clawing at every adult. The boys pushed on, guiding the aircraft through turbulence that tossed them like a toy on waves. Their bodies hurt with every jolt, back sore from being slammed into seats, but they moved as one, instinct overriding exhaustion. The co-pilot relayed instructions from air traffic control, his words chopped by static, but the meaning was clear enough. A new airfield had been identified, a military strip 20 miles ahead, barely within reach. Its runways were long enough, but the storm raged hardest in that direction. It was a cruel choice, safety waiting beyond the most dangerous path. The older boy's throat felt raw as he croaked out the decision. They would take it. He had no other options left, and the truth settled in his bones like ice. They banked the aircraft toward the coordinates, engines groaning under the strain, passengers gripping each other as the turn pushed them sideways. The plane shuddered in protest, wings slicing through sheets of rain so heavy it blurred the windows to white. Inside the cockpit, the storm roared louder than the engines. Rain battered the glass in relentless waves, lightning flickered, thunder cracked like artillery fire. The younger boy kept his eyes locked on the instruments, refusing to look outside, because the sight of the storm's fury might break him. He recited the checklist under his breath, words tumbling into a rhythm that steadied his shaking hands. The older one focused on throttle and descent calculations, his mind racing faster than his heart. Every adjustment had to be perfect. Every mistake would mean disaster. Then came the near fall. A violent downdraft slammed into the aircraft, pitching it downward with brutal force. Passengers screamed as the cabin tilted, oxygen masks pulling taut against their faces. Drinks, bags and loose objects hurtled through the aisles. The boys were nearly wrenched from their seats, bodies straining against belts, hands gripping controls with desperate force. The younger ones shouted numbers, altitude dropping too fast, the ground rushing closer though none could see it through the storm. Panic spread like wildfire among the passengers, a cacophony of cries and prayers filling the air. The co-pilot barked commands, his voice sharp now, cutting through fear. The older boy yanked back on the yoke with every ounce of strength, arms trembling, teeth gritted. The nose lifted, but slowly, painfully slowly, as though the storm itself was dragging them into the earth. Seconds stretched into eternity before the aircraft finally leveled, altitude stabilizing just above disaster. A silence heavier than screams filled the cabin, broken only by ragged breaths and the groan of the engines. They had cheated death by the slimmest margin, but the reprieve came at a cost. The fuel gauge now sat firmly in the red. The military strip was still ahead, a ghost waiting in the storm, but the boys knew they would have only one chance. No second approach, no circling, no hesitation. The co-pilot explained the procedures quickly, his words clipped, efficient as if trying to carve order into chaos. The older boy listened with half his mind while the other half replayed his simulator drills, stitching fragments of training into a plan. The younger one steadied the descent, fingers trembling on the controls, each breath a silent prayer that metal and willpower would hold together long enough. In the cabin the mood shifted. Passengers, though terrified, sensed the finality in the plane's movements. There was no turning back, no waiting for calmer skies. Whatever happened next would decide everything. Some closed their eyes, surrendering to fate. Others stared straight ahead, refusing to miss a single second of the fight for their lives. The flight attendants sat strapped into their jump seats, hands clasped tight, eyes glistening as they whispered encouragement under their breath for the boys they had once tried to block from entering the cockpit. The storm howled louder, as if determined to consume them before the runway appeared. Rain hammered against metal skin, lightning painted the sky white, and the plane trembled on the edge of control. Yet through it all, the boys pressed forward, inch by inch, breath by breath, clinging to the fragile thread of hope. The runway was out there. They knew it. They just had to reach it before time, fuel, or fate gave out. And as the last drops of fuel burned, the outlines of land began to break through the storm, faint lights flickering in the distance. The military strip had appeared. But the hardest part was still to come, because sighting a runway was not the same as reaching it alive. What followed would demand more than training, more than courage. It would demand that two boys become something more than anyone ever believed they could be. The faint lights of the military strip glowed through the storm like stars blurred by rain, fragile and distant, yet the sight alone sent a tremor of hope through the cockpit. The boys locked their eyes on those lights, knowing they represented the only thread connecting them to survival. The co-pilot rattled off final procedures, his tone urgent but steadier than before, as though he had surrendered to the idea that these teenagers were their last chance. The storm still howled, the plane groaned with fatigue, and the fuel gauge lay buried in the red. Every warning light flickered like a countdown. There would be no second chance, no missed approach, no time to correct mistakes. This descent would decide 142 lives. The older boy leaned into the controls, his muscles aching, his shoulders burning as he kept the nose steady against crosswinds that slammed at the fuselage like fists. His younger companion monitored instruments, calling out altitudes, speeds, flap settings, his voice tight but precise, every syllable carrying the weight of survival. Lightning cracked against the horizon, thunder rolling like cannon fire, but their focus never wavered. The co-pilot's instructions blended with their training, fragments of memory guiding their hands as instinct and discipline merged into something larger than themselves. In the cabin, silence had spread, the kind of silence born not of calm but of resignation. Passengers held hands across aisles, heads bowed in prayer, eyes wide with fear. Some whispered promises to loved ones they might never see again. Others stared straight ahead, refusing to look away from the invisible battle being fought behind the cockpit door. The flight attendants strapped in, their eyes locked on the boys they had once doubted, their lips moving with prayers for courage that did not belong to themselves but to the children who had stepped into the role of men. The descent grew rougher as the storm pressed down, pockets of turbulence sending the aircraft lurching, wings groaning, passengers gasping with every drop. Oxygen masks bounced with each jolt, overhead bins rattled, loose items skittered across the floor. The younger boy's hand slipped for a second on the throttle, but he caught himself, jaw tightening as he steadied it. His friend shot him a glance, not of reproach but of solidarity, and together they pressed forward. Their silence spoke louder than words. They were no longer just two boys. They were pilots carrying the weight of souls. The runway lights grew larger, closer, yet still blurred by sheets of rain. The older boy lined the nose with a faint strip, his heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst from his chest. He remembered every landing drill, every simulation where mistakes were forgiven by the reset of a button. Here there would be no reset. The younger one called out the descent rate, his voice cracking slightly, but he forced the tremor down. The co-pilot gripped the console, white-knuckled, murmuring guidance, his eyes darting between the gauges and the boys' faces, torn between disbelief and awe. The final approach began. The plane was too fast, rain hammering against the windshield so hard it blurred vision, but there was no time to slow carefully. The runway stretched ahead, dark and wet, a narrow lifeline in the storm. The older boy forced the nose down, adjusting for crosswinds, feeling the aircraft fight him every inch. The younger one managed flaps and throttle, balancing descent with the last remnants of fuel. The ground rushed closer, the storm screamed, passengers braced, eyes clenched shut, breaths caught in throats. The first contact came hard, the wheels slamming against the wet concrete, jolting everybody in the cabin. Gasps and screams erupted as the aircraft bounced once, twice, tires skidding on slick surfaces, the plane swaying dangerously as though it might veer off the strip. The older boy fought the yoke, his arms trembling, his body straining against belts as he forced the nose straight, pushing every ounce of strength into holding the line. The younger one pulled the throttle back, slamming controls with desperate precision. Sparks flew from the tires, smoke rose, but the plane slowed. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the roaring beast surrendered to momentum. Finally, with one last shudder, the aircraft screeched to a halt, rain hissing across its metal skin. For a moment, no one moved. Silence blanketed the cabin like snow after an avalanche, stunned and absolute. Then it broke. Sobs, shouts, cries of relief filled the air as passengers clutched each other, laughter and tears mingling in disbelief. The flight attendants unbuckled, running to embrace strangers, whispering prayers of thanks. The co-pilot slumped forward, hands covering his face, trembling not from fear now but from the crushing release of it. And the boys, still strapped into their seats, sat frozen, their hands shaking uncontrollably, unable to let go of the controls even though the engines had quieted and the danger had passed. They looked at each other, eyes wide, faces pale, realizing in that instant how close they had come to death and how fragile the line was between failure and triumph. They had not cheered, they had not celebrated. They simply breathed, gasping in rhythm with the slowing hum of engines, their bodies finally allowing the exhaustion to sink in. Passengers pressed toward the cockpit door, some shouting their gratitude, others too overwhelmed to speak. When the door opened, the sight of two teenagers sitting in the captain's seat left them stunned. Many wept harder, realizing children had carried them through the storm. As emergency vehicles pulled alongside the aircraft, flashing lights cutting through rain, the world outside caught up with the miracle that had just occurred. Firefighters and medics rushed aboard, pulling the unconscious captain away, checking passengers for injuries. Reporters would later write headlines, cameras would later capture their faces, but in that moment, the boys were still just trembling figures in oversized seats, gripping the memory of survival like a wound that had not yet healed. When they finally stood, their legs weak, they stepped into a cabin of applause. Passengers reached for their hands, hugged them, thanked them with tears streaking down weathered cheeks. The boys lowered their heads, shy under the weight of so much gratitude, still barely believing themselves what they had done. They had entered the cockpit as children, doubted and dismissed, but they emerged as saviors of 142 lives. And as they walked down the steps into the storm's fading rain, past flashing lights and shaking hands, they understood that nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. They had touched the line between life and death, and against all odds, they had brought an entire plane back across it. They had left the ground as boys, but when their feet touched the wet tarmac, they were something else entirely, proof that courage is not measured in years, but in the moments when the world demands everything and you choose to give it. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.